Welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we are covering what may be the most consequential week in American foreign policy since the invasion of Iraq. The United States and Israel have launched missile strikes on schools near Tehran. Let that sink in. Schools. Not military installations, not weapons depots, schools in the city of Tehran. Iranian media is reporting this as the latest in a series of escalating attacks, coming just 6 days after the single deadliest strike of this entire war on Iran, which killed 165 people. Al Jazeera is reporting this, but where is the American press?
That's exactly the right question, Alex. Because while CNN and MSNBC are running segments about presidential approval ratings, 2 schools were hit by missiles fired by the United States and Israel. We need to be very precise about what's happening here. This is not a targeted strike on a nuclear facility. This is not a surgical operation against military leadership. These are missiles hitting educational institutions in a populated area near the Iranian capital. The pattern we're seeing is the systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure, and it mirrors exactly what we've documented in Gaza for over 2 years now.
And that brings us to the legal and constitutional dimension of this, which is being completely ignored by mainstream coverage. Andrew Napolitano, a former judge and constitutional scholar, has written a devastating piece for Consortium News titled "Trump's Unjust and Unconstitutional War." His argument is not partisan, it's structural. The Constitution of the United States explicitly grants the power to declare war to Congress, not the President. Article 1, Section 8. This is not ambiguous. This is not a gray area. And yet here we are, with a president waging a full-scale military campaign against a sovereign nation without a congressional declaration of war.
Napolitano's argument goes deeper than just the legal technicality, Alex. He's warning about something far more dangerous, the slow and inexorable normalization of presidential force. Every time a president initiates military action without congressional approval and Congress responds by retroactively ratifying it or simply looking the other way, it sets a precedent. It moves the baseline. What was once considered an extraordinary and illegal abuse of executive power becomes routine. We saw it with Libya under Obama. We saw it with the assassination of Soleimani under Trump's first term. And now we're seeing it at an entirely new scale.
And let's be honest about what congressional ratification after the fact really means. It's not a check on power, it's a rubber stamp. Napolitano makes this point forcefully. If Congress gets into the business of simply blessing wars the president has already started, then the constitutional requirement of a declaration of war becomes meaningless. It becomes theater. The founders designed this system specifically because they understood that executives would always be tempted to wage war for political purposes, for economic purposes, for purposes that have nothing to do with national defense.
And that's what makes this moment so critical. Because we have to ask, what is the strategic justification for bombing schools near Tehran? What possible military objective does that serve? The answer, when you strip away the propaganda, is that this is about establishing dominance and breaking the will of a civilian population. That is not defense. That is not even conventional warfare. Under international humanitarian law, under the Geneva Conventions, deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure is a war crime. Full stop. And the United States is a signatory to those conventions.
Now let's connect this to what's happening in Azerbaijan, because these stories are not isolated, they are part of the same geopolitical chessboard. Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev has come out and slammed what he's calling an act of terror, after 4 people were injured in an alleged Iranian drone strike on Azerbaijani territory. Middle East Eye is reporting this, and the language is important. Aliyev is calling it terrorism. Not an act of war, not a military provocation, terrorism. That word is doing very specific political work, and we need to understand what that work is.
Absolutely. When a head of state uses the word terrorism to describe a military strike by another state, they are invoking an entirely different framework. Terrorism implies illegitimacy. It implies that the perpetrator exists outside the rules of the international order. It's the same language the United States uses to justify extrajudicial killings, indefinite detention, and wars without end. By framing the Iranian drone strikes as terrorism rather than as acts of war, Aliyev is positioning Azerbaijan as a victim and Iran as a rogue actor, which conveniently aligns Azerbaijan with the US-Israeli coalition against Iran.
And right on cue, Turkey has entered the picture. Turkey's foreign ministry, as reported by Middle East Eye, has strongly condemned the drone attacks on Azerbaijan. Now, Turkey and Azerbaijan have deep ethnic, linguistic, and military ties. Turkey has been Azerbaijan's primary military backer for years, particularly during the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. So Turkey's condemnation is not just diplomatic language, it's a signal. It's a signal that NATO's eastern flank is being activated against Iran, and that the regional coalition the US has been building is solidifying in real time.
Let's map this out for our audience, because the mainstream media presents these as disconnected events. The US and Israel are bombing Iran directly, hitting schools, killing civilians by the hundreds. Simultaneously, Iran is allegedly striking at Azerbaijan with drones, which could be retaliatory or could be an attempt to disrupt energy infrastructure that feeds Western markets. And Turkey, a NATO member, is using this as justification to deepen its involvement. What you're looking at is the architecture of a regional war that extends far beyond Iran's borders, and every piece is being moved into place deliberately.
And who benefits from this architecture? Follow the money, follow the power. The US defense industry is experiencing a massive surge in contracts. Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, their stock prices tell you everything you need to know about who profits from this war. Israel's far-right government under Netanyahu benefits because a regional war drowns out international pressure over Gaza and the occupation. Azerbaijan benefits because a weakened Iran means less support for Armenia and more leverage over Caspian energy routes. Turkey benefits because Erdogan gets to project power and distract from domestic economic crises.
And who loses? The Iranian people lose. The children in those schools near Paran lose. The 4 people injured in Azerbaijan lose. American service members who may be deployed into this escalating conflict lose. American taxpayers who are funding billions of dollars in military operations while infrastructure crumbles at home, they lose. The constitutional order of the United States loses every time a president wages war without the consent of the people's representatives. The entire framework of international law loses when the most powerful nations on earth treat the Geneva Conventions as suggestions rather than obligations.
Let's go deeper on the Al Jazeera opinion piece, because it articulates something that the Western press absolutely will not say. The headline is, Israel puts a target on the back of the rules-based order. The argument is that Israel has effectively communicated that anyone who attempts to enforce international law regarding Gaza, whether it's the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, or individual nations, will face consequences. The destruction of an Iranian warship is being held up as a demonstration of what happens when you challenge Israeli impunity.
This is extraordinary when you think about what it means. The so-called rules-based international order, which the United States and its allies have invoked for decades to justify interventions in Iraq, Libya, Yugoslavia, and elsewhere, is now being explicitly threatened by one of America's closest allies. Israel is essentially saying, these rules apply to our enemies, but they do not apply to us. And if you try to make them apply to us, we will destroy you. That's not a rules-based order. That's an empire-based order, where the rules exist only to constrain the powerless.
And the United States is complicit in this. Every missile that hits a school near Tehran with American markings on it, every diplomatic veto at the UN Security Council, every weapons shipment to Israel, it all reinforces the message that international law is a tool of the powerful, not a constraint on them. Napolitano's constitutional argument dovetails perfectly with this. When the president can wage war without Congress, and when the world's most powerful military alliance can bomb civilian targets without consequence, you don't have a system of laws. You have a system of force dressed up in legal language.
And this is where the media failure becomes most acute. The American press is not connecting these dots. They're covering the Iran strikes as if they exist in a vacuum, as if they're a response to some imminent threat that justifies extraordinary measures. They're covering the Azerbaijan situation as a separate regional dispute. They're covering the constitutional questions as academic legal debate. But these are all facets of the same reality, a unilateral war being waged by the executive branch of the United States, in alliance with Israel, with no congressional authorization, no legal justification under international law, and no accountability.
Let's talk about the propaganda architecture, because it's sophisticated and it works. The framing you see on American cable news is that Iran is the aggressor. Iran is the threat. Iran's nuclear program, Iran's proxies, Iran's regional ambitions. And none of that context includes the fact that the United States overthrew Iran's democratically elected government in 1953, imposed decades of crippling sanctions, assassinated one of its top military commanders on foreign soil, and is now actively bombing its cities. If any other country did to the United States what we've done to Iran, we would call it an act of war. We would call it an invasion.
The historical amnesia is deliberate, Alex. It serves a function. If the American public understood the full history of US-Iran relations, the CIA coup against Mossadegh, the support for the Shah's brutal secret police, the shooting down of Iran Air Flight 655 that killed 290 civilians, the unilateral withdrawal from the nuclear deal that Iran was complying with, if they understood all of that, the current war would be impossible to sell. So the history gets erased. Every conflict begins at the moment that's most convenient for the aggressor's narrative. Iran becomes the villain with no backstory, no context, no legitimate grievances.
Now, the Azerbaijan angle deserves more scrutiny because there's something that's not being reported. If Iran did launch drones at Azerbaijan, and we should note that at this point it's being described as alleged, the question is why. Iran has historically had tensions with Azerbaijan over several issues: Azerbaijan's close military relationship with Israel, which includes significant arms sales and intelligence cooperation, concerns about pan-Turkic nationalism and its implications for Iran's Azerbaijani minority population, and Azerbaijan's growing alignment with Western energy interests in the Caspian region. A country under active bombardment by the US and Israel might see Azerbaijan as a hostile forward operating platform.
That's a critical point. Azerbaijan has been deepening its security relationship with Israel for years. Israeli drones and surveillance technology played a significant role in Azerbaijan's military victory in Nagorno-Karabakh. There are credible reports of Israeli intelligence assets operating from Azerbaijani territory. So when we hear that Iran allegedly struck Azerbaijan with drones, we need to ask whether this is Iran lashing out irrationally, which is how it will be framed, or whether Iran is striking at what it perceives as part of the military infrastructure being used against it. That distinction matters enormously, and the Western media is not making it.
And Turkey's condemnation fits perfectly into this framework. Turkey is a NATO member. Under Article 5, an attack on one NATO member is theoretically an attack on all. Now, Azerbaijan is not a NATO member, but Turkey's strong condemnation and its deep military ties to Azerbaijan create a de facto extension of the NATO umbrella. If Turkey frames Iranian strikes on Azerbaijan as an attack on a Turkish ally that requires a Turkish response, you now have a NATO country in direct military confrontation with Iran. That's how regional wars become global ones. That's how 1914 happens.
And let's be clear about what NATO involvement would mean. It would mean that the legal fig leaf of this is a limited operation against Iranian nuclear facilities is gone. It would mean a multi-front war involving the United States, Israel, Turkey, and potentially other NATO allies against Iran and whatever allies Iran can mobilize, possibly including Russia, which has its own strategic interests in Iran. We are talking about the potential for a conflict that dwarfs anything we've seen since World War II. And it's being escalated without debate, without authorization, without the informed consent of the people who will bear the costs.
And that brings us back to Napolitano's constitutional argument, because it's not just a legal abstraction, it's the only institutional mechanism we have to prevent exactly this kind of catastrophic escalation. The founders put the war power in Congress specifically because they understood that a single executive, surrounded by advisors with their own interests, insulated from the consequences of combat, will always be tempted to use military force. The congressional requirement was supposed to be the brake on that impulse. It was supposed to force debate, transparency, and democratic accountability. Every time we bypass it, we accelerate toward exactly the kind of unchecked military adventurism we're witnessing right now.
And what's happening in Congress right now? Are there hearings? Are there floor debates? Are members demanding a vote on this war? A few voices, and I want to give credit where it's due, have raised constitutional objections. But the institutional response has been catastrophically inadequate. Both parties share responsibility for this. The erosion of the war power has been a bipartisan project spanning decades. Democrats expanded executive warmaking under Obama and Clinton. Republicans expanded it under both Bush administrations and Trump. The result is a presidency that functions as a war-making machine with no meaningful democratic constraints.
Let's also address the humanitarian dimension that's being buried in the coverage. Al Jazeera reports that the strikes on schools near Tehran come 6 days after the deadliest single attack of the war on Iran, which killed 165 people. 165. Can we sit with that number for a moment? These are human beings. They are parents and children and teachers and workers. And the American media treats these deaths as statistics, as background noise, as the acceptable cost of pursuing whatever strategic objective is supposedly being served. When the United States loses soldiers, we learn their names, their hometowns, their stories. When Iranian civilians are killed by American missiles, they're a number in a paragraph.
That dehumanization is essential to maintaining public support for the war, or at least public indifference, which serves the same purpose. If Americans saw the footage of those school buildings in Tehran reduced to rubble, if they saw the parents digging through concrete for their children, if they heard the screaming and the sirens, this war would be politically untenable within a week. That's why the coverage is abstract and sanitized. That's why we hear about strikes on targets instead of missiles hitting schools. The language is designed to prevent empathy, because empathy is the enemy of empire.
Now I want to connect all of this to the broader pattern that Al Jazeera's opinion piece identifies, the destruction of the rules-based order. Because what we're witnessing is not just a war against Iran. It's a war against the very concept that powerful nations can be held accountable. When Israel suggests that those who try to enforce international law will meet the fate of a destroyed warship, it's issuing a threat to every international institution, every human rights organization, every nation that might dare to say, this is illegal. The International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants. The International Court of Justice issued provisional measures. And the response has been, we don't care, and will destroy anyone who tries to enforce them.
And the United States backs this position. That's what makes it so devastating. The country that built the post-World War II international legal framework, the United Nations, the Geneva Conventions, the Nuremberg Principles, is now actively dismantling that framework to protect its allies from accountability. The hypocrisy is staggering, but it's also strategic. A world without enforceable international law is a world where military power is the only currency that matters. And in that world, the United States and its allies hold the overwhelming advantage. So the destruction of international law isn't a side effect of this war, it's one of the objectives.
So let's summarize what we're looking at. The United States is waging an unconstitutional war against Iran without congressional authorization, in violation of the War Powers Clause and in defiance of the constitutional framework designed to prevent exactly this. American and Israeli missiles are hitting civilian targets including schools, killing hundreds of people. Iran, under bombardment, is allegedly striking at Azerbaijan, which has deep military ties to Israel. Turkey, a NATO member, is condemning these strikes in terms that could justify military escalation. Israel is explicitly threatening anyone who tries to enforce international law. And the American media is failing catastrophically to connect any of these dots or hold anyone accountable.
And we should note who is reporting this, because it tells you something about the state of journalism. The constitutional analysis is coming from Consortium News, an independent outlet. The details about the school bombings are coming from Al Jazeera, a Qatari news network. The Azerbaijan and Turkey coverage is from Middle East Eye, a UK-based outlet focused on the region. The American corporate press, with all its resources and access, is not leading on any of these stories. They are following the narrative set by the Pentagon and the State Department instead of challenging it. That is not journalism. That is stenography.
And that's why shows like this one exist. That's why independent media matters. Because when the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN decide that their role is to transmit government talking points rather than to interrogate them, it falls to independent journalists and analysts to do the work that a free press is supposed to do. The stakes could not be higher. We are watching the constitutional order of the United States erode in real time. We are watching international law be demolished by the countries that created it. We are watching civilians die in a war that no one voted for and no one authorized.
So what do we do? First, demand that your representatives in Congress take a vote on this war. Not a resolution of support, not a letter of concern, an actual vote on a declaration of war, as the Constitution requires. Call their offices. Show up at their town halls. Make it politically impossible for them to hide behind procedural excuses. Second, seek out independent media. Read Consortium News, Al Jazeera, Middle East Eye, The Intercept, and other outlets that are doing actual investigative journalism instead of repeating Pentagon press releases. Third, refuse to accept the dehumanization of Iranian civilians. Learn their names. See their faces. Reject the propaganda that turns human beings into acceptable collateral damage.
And finally, understand that what's happening right now will define the world your children inherit. If we allow the executive branch to wage war without constraint, if we allow civilian targets to be bombed without consequence, if we allow international law to be destroyed by the nations that wrote it, then we are building a world governed by nothing but force. That is not the world any of us should want. The Constitution, for all its flaws, gave us a mechanism to prevent this. International law, for all its limitations, gave us a framework for accountability. Both are under attack. Both need defending. And both require citizens who refuse to look away.
This is Maya Clarity. Stay informed, stay engaged, and demand the truth. Because when the powerful can wage war without accountability, it is only the truth, spoken loudly, spoken often, spoken by ordinary people who refuse to be silenced, that stands between civilization and catastrophe. We'll see you next time on Truth Report.